Welcome to the Athletic Performance Podcast, a conversation for all things performance related. I'm your host, Ryan Patrick, and today we're going to do a deep dive on everything speed, power, and strength. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode. This week's guest is JP Guerrero, a performance coach at the Strength House in Harvard, Massachusetts. JP is an exciting young coach who first caught my attention when he began applying Bill Hartman's model to baseball athletes. JP's journey into coaching started after his baseball career at a Division II college in New Mexico was cut short by a series of injuries. These challenges sent him on a path to becoming an athletic development and performance coach. His unique background, combined with the expertise of the incredible team at the Strength House, has led to some innovative solutions for the movement challenges baseball players face. And that's exactly why I had to bring him on the podcast today. In our conversation, we dive into JP's transition from injured athlete to coach, discussing the assessment process and movement lens they use at the Strength House to create individualized training programs for their athletes. We explore how technology and big data in baseball complement their observations and how they use this information to maintain high intensity during training sessions. JP shares insights on how they manage the external stress their athletes face, whether from hitting or pitching lessons, and the importance of keeping things simple so their athletes can execute and achieve the changes they're aiming for. All in all, this was a fantastic episode with an inspiring young coach. When you finish listening, please rate and review this podcast with 5 stars. And if you'd like to ask a question or suggest a guest, email us at athleticpod@gmail.com. That's athleticpod@gmail.com. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, welcome back. I am super excited for today's guest, JP Guerrero. Man, I've been following you for a little bit on social media, like we were just talking about offline, and really enjoy what you guys are doing with the baseball population, especially your implementation of Bill Hartman's model and some of the nuances that come with that. So I'm excited to dive deep into that. But before I get too carried away, can you start by telling the listeners a little bit about yourself and what led you to your work with baseball players?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Roswell, New Mexico, born and raised. Little like dairy town in southeast New Mexico, UFO themed. Like alien crash there in the 40s. Went to New Mexico Military Institute for high school and junior college. Played baseball there for junior college. And then after 2 years there, got recruited, transferred to a D2 in northern New Mexico Highlands, and pitched there for another 2 years. But my first year there, I tore my labrum first semester. And during the physical therapy and rehab process, I kind of just started gravitating a little more towards the training side and player development side of baseball, and started to notice that I was taking more of an interest in that side of the game than playing personally. And so started developing my own lifting program, my own throwing program. Once I kind of got comfortable doing that, started, reaching out to my teammates and being like, hey, you throw 83, maybe we can put you on a throwing program and help you get to 85, or, you're having elbow pain, maybe we could try this out. And so started experimenting with teammates and, my buddies and getting feedback from them doing that. And then after I got done playing and graduated, I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and began really just full in on the training side of my career. Worked in Las Cruces for 2 years, and then got hired on as an intern at the Strength House last summer. Learned the Bill Hartman model with Greg and had a mentorship with Greg Robbins. Learned a lot through him. And then after the summer, thankfully, he hired me on. And, I've been blessed to be able to have the opportunity to work at the Strength House for the past year.
Yeah. So in the process of your rehab, did you feel like it was a failed rehab? Because I find that's what inspires a lot of guys to take things into their own hands.
It was a frustrating process of, I would feel 100%, and then, whether it was a PT or an athletic trainer would be like, well, in this part of your process, I don't think we're there yet. Even though personally, I can feel like, well, I have the full range of motion in my shoulder and, my shoulder feels stronger again where I can be able to throw again. And I felt like they were sticking to the plan, which is, smart. And then as an athlete, you always want to kind of rush yourself. But I felt like the plan was taking longer than it should have. And
Mm-hmm.
I felt that they were doing a lot of stuff that didn't fit my needs. And that's where I kind of started to try to deep dive into different throwing programs, different lifting programs, and see what they were doing with guys with similar injuries. Or listen, Robbie Rowland was a big one. I'd listen to his podcast and him talk about guys with shoulder injuries or shoulder injuries he's gone through, and listen to those processes, and then really think about how the physical therapy that and rehab that I was doing was a little more cookie cutter, where you weren't getting the results as quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's kind of what led me to go down the path.
Very cool. So how'd you happen upon Greg and the Strength House? Because they're not, they're not exos. They're in this little area in like Massachusetts or
Yeah,
wherever you guys are in the Northeast. So how did you even get connected with him?
I think they popped up on my Discover page. I want to say Coach Wilsey. Um,
Okay.
he popped up on my Discover page one day. It was a hitting post. I kind of took a small look at it. I liked, what he was talking about in the caption. Gave him a follow. Found the Strength House page shortly after that. Gave them a follow. And then was just like small, like, here and there, following in on what they would post, and check in and try to read something new from them. Then I started kind of deep diving into Greg's blogs on the website, and began to really take an interest of what they were doing, and kind of buying into that, and noticing that it's very untraditional,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not we're gonna slam heavy weights and we're gonna just basically throw every day as hard as we can, or it's a lot more. You're gonna crush some weights, but we're also gonna gain you some movement capabilities that you didn't know you had.
Very cool. Anytime we start talking about this whole process of developing an athlete, or you just kind of getting immersed in some of this Bill Hartman
Yeah.
model, and I know you guys are pulling other pieces in, but I think when people start asking about this, I feel like the first place to really begin is at the level of the assessment. So we've got a
Yep.
baseball player. It's an asymmetrical human playing an asymmetrical sport. And in order to make some informed decisions about what to do with their training, we have to have better assessments.
Yep.
So when it comes to your guys' assessment process, and just, it could be the specifics of the assessment or just some of the thought processes behind it. What are some of the big rocks that you guys are looking for as these athletes are going through the evaluation process?
So the first thing we take on their initial eval is we measure their infrasternal angle. So it's the angle of the lower ribs. So there's two archetypes. It's narrows and wides, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a big gradient. So you're either a narrow, narrow, wide, wide, or somewhere in the middle, right? And it just kind of gives us an idea of what your strength and weaknesses will be. So wides typically favor internal rotation, narrows favor external rotation. Understanding that first. So we take that. Then we take your normal, table measurement: shoulder flexion, internal rotation, external rotation, hip flexion, internal rotation, external rotation, and then hip extension. Um, and so we take those into mind. But the thing I look at the most is the movement tests. So we'll take
Mm-hmm.
posture pictures, and this will kind of show how they stand in a relaxed state. So I just had a post recently about how one of the pitchers I work with, his left scap was pinned against his rib cage. So you can see that in the posture picture, and now okay, well, he needs that space to rotate into whenever he's throwing. The rib cage needs to be able to turn to the left, so I need to be able to open up that space. So you can see that through the posture pictures. And then whenever they do their squats, split squats, toe touch, and a load propulsion test, which is just like a knee pickup, you can see where they're lacking there. So if a kid side bends on a load propulsion test, he's lacking internal rotation on that side. Or if his knee kicks out, he's lacking hip flexion. So you can kind of get an idea through the movement tests. And then the big one that we also use is we have them hop on our force plates. We have Hawkins force plates, and we have them do a vertical jump and a rebound, multi-rebound. And this will show where they're at in space too, because it shows their force development, how they're applying the force, how they're absorbing the force, and what basically what side they're favoring. So if you see a narrow and they go on the force plate and they basically don't get an unweight on that left side and then all their force is through the right side, you know that whenever they're standing relaxed, that they're probably in that last compensation that narrows go into of smushing down on the right side.
Okay. There's a lot of pieces at play here, and I want to dive in on the ISA because I see a lot of people talking about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone became like really privy to the ISA. It's been around for a long, long time. I think there were some therapists in the 20s or 30s that were
Yep.
even alluding to these things. Um, but it's not really the place to put all the eggs in the basket, is it?
No.
Okay. Would you care to elaborate on that a little bit? Because I know a lot of people hearing this have been like, "Oh, the ISA, they're wide, they're narrow," and this is
Yep.
like that's kind of it. But you've already talked about this progression of compensatory patterns. Where does the ISA lead us, and then where do you see it's falling short in your ability to actually make some training decisions for these athletes?
I would say it's a very small piece of the puzzle, and I think it's probably the first thing to look at. Um, but a big thing you can look at with the ISA is where their compressions are and where their expansions are. Example of this is I have a hitter I work with where his left ISA is basically completely pushed in and then his right side flares out. So you
Hmm.
know that whenever he loads, he basically can't engage that left side and he's just going to crunch down in that left side and kick himself outside the base on the right. And that's something you can just tell by looking at the ISA is, okay, well, he doesn't have that space to acquire whatever shape or position you want him to acquire. So that's something that we need to kind of open up on that side. And then I would say for people to definitely not deep dive too much on the ISA and just keep it as an idea, and like I said, it's a very small piece of the puzzle. It's definitely not going to tell you everything you need to know, and it just helps you find a little bit more answers than that what you're looking for.
Yeah, my first exposure to the ISA was probably like, I'm like, oh, this is great. We've got structure. We
Yep.
know that structure dictates function. So I have this idea of what these people are going to do. And I've yet to meet like a really decent athlete who's only at like a primary compensation, right? They're usually two or three steps down the line.
Yeah,
And
there.
so all this stuff fell apart for me really quick. But I think that's incredibly valuable. Now, I want to come back to this, but I also want to first touch on the technology you guys are using
Mhm.
because when I think baseball, I think of like Moneyball, statistics. There's all these high speed cameras. You've got radar guns that are tracking spin rate. Like it is a data driven sport, and
Mhm.
you guys are just using force plates. Now, in my area locally, we've got these pitching programs that are using all these high speed cameras on what I feel like are fairly young athletes that
Yep.
probably don't really need to be worrying about some of this stuff. So for you guys, um, how is this playing into your decision making, and then what do you feel like is just noise? And I guess from a bigger perspective, how are you selling this to your athletes? Like, hey, we're not going to worry about a lot of this stuff. We're going to do these movement things, and they're there to get some more velo. So
Yep.
I know it's a complicated question, but it's like, how are you integrating all this and really packaging what you guys are doing as being different than some of these technology driven programs out there?
So big technology we use is we use a lot of velocity based training. We use the Hawkins force plates, and then we use the like the timing gates you'd use to test
Mm-hmm.
30s and 10-yard sprints. And then when they're throwing or hitting, the typical hit tracks, pocket radar, and occasional trackman, right? Um, for the lifting portions, I would say they're very good environmental constraint. So you
Mm-hmm.
you put a kid on a squat bar, and now you put their phone in front of them with the VBT on the bar, and you're like, hey, I want you to load up this bar where this speed is at 0.75 meters per second, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to try to keep it above that number every time. Now that's something that they can compete with, and as athletes, all we want to do is compete. So I feel that if I put 315 pounds on my back and you told me, okay, you got 3 sets of 5 of back squat. Okay, well, let me just rep out these five reps. There's no intensity in it. I might lose interest versus you do the same thing. Hey, you have a 3x5, but you have to beat this number every time. So now I have that environmental constraint in my head where I'm really going to push myself to obtain that number or go over that number every time. In terms of what I think is a little bit of eyewash, I think we get a little ahead of ourselves with the baseball, and every technology that we use. I think a simple pocket radar definitely does the job. And then if you're really trying to get in depth and advanced with, if you're working on pitch shape or, you're trying to um, increase your spin rate, the stuff that's very advanced statistics, then you can go with a TrackMan. But I think a simple, training program with a throwing program where you mix in a pocket radar every day to see where you're at. And one way we do it is we'll have a throwing program and we'll tell a guy, okay, you're off the mound today, but I want your velo to be 82, 84. And now they have to sit within that, and then it's more than hopping on a mound or just throwing as hard as you can every day, or always trying to PR on a velo. I think there's bigger things than that, and you can get those velo gains without chasing them every single day.
Let me ask you guys a question. Do you have your guys throw pins at your facility?
Most of them do. I would say
Okay.
most of our pitchers do. Um, we'll occasionally put them on a TrackMan, but it's usually, we have them on a pocket radar, and like I said, we're just using it more as a constraint than really trying to ramp up and test where they're at, unless that's what the goal is for that day.
Okay. Because this is a vast difference in what we do at our
Mm-hmm.
facility. So I'm a little curious about this because our guys are not throwing anything. So sometimes they're coming in. I'm sure you have athletes that maybe have other pitching coaches,
Yep.
or obviously they're traveling for tournaments. How are you managing some of that extracurricular stress that they're getting with what you guys are trying to accomplish with them?
We have, so me personally, I have my kids and they have a basically like throwing notes sheet in their program. So it helps me track. So if a kid comes in and he's like, hey, I'm a long toss 350 feet today, and then I go into his program and I'm like, well, you threw 3 innings yesterday in a game. So now that tells me like, okay, well, we need to tone that down a little bit. Or, hey, I met with my pitching coach yesterday. I want to throw a bullpen today because my bullpen yesterday didn't go well. So trying to get them to understand like, well, you need to have a goal and you need to stick to the plan instead of, okay, I had a bad day yesterday. Let me go in today and throw another bullpen and just hope that it'll be better than it was yesterday. And helping them understand like you're going to have bad days, and
Yeah.
it's better to just stick to the plan and keep building than chase that good day that you're really looking for all the time.
Yeah, for sure. And as another question to some of these constraints here, you're talking about like velocity based training,
Mhm.
driving this motor output very high. And one of the areas that I think becomes challenging is anytime I'm ramping that motor output or I'm using bilateral sagittal plane types of exercises, I'm thinking about we're probably going to be driving some level of compression. Totally
Yep.
fine, absolutely necessary. But I also have to get athletes to play on the other side of the fence where, hey, if we're trying to reacquire certain ranges of motion or get a left scap to open up, we've got to implement some of these other activities. So
Mhm.
when you've got athletes who come in who are pretty squished, they're getting yanked down on that right side, they're not able to really get off and push left. How are you balancing these two sides of the same coin to make sure that they're still progressing in the ways that you guys want? Because obviously we can't completely detrain them and
Yep.
unload them and woosah our way to 95 on the mound.
Yep.
But you've also got to manage that. So I'm just curious how you guys go about this.
So it's definitely, it's probably the most challenging part of managing the interference that you kind of create while also
Mm-hmm.
trying to make changes from the interference that they get from playing. And I would say it's all in the rolling and the pre-work. So if they execute their foam rolling properly and they help down regulate that muscle activity, now you put them in some ground-based exercises and they acquire the shapes you want and they open up that space. And then as you progress through the workout, you build in intensity. And you can put a guy on the ground and knock out a hook line cross connect, and then right after that, maybe do a cable chop. And right after that, now I do a step up. So I'm building up how much internal rotation I'm really applying into the ground. And I'm acquiring and applying more force into the ground, that now whenever I get to that back squat, I have space that I didn't have when I came in, or I have space to move into for my deadlift that I didn't have when I came in. And then now after that's over, give them something small that's just going to kind of deregulate or unregulate that compression that just happened from the, the deadlift, the squat, whatever. And now I'm managing it, and just not letting that interference go a little overboard.
Yeah, for sure. Working with, I told you before offline that Greg did my programming for several months. And one of the things that I really took away with that I have come full circle on, and I guess Eric Cressy was the first person I really ever heard talk about using fillers,
Yep.
right? And back then it might have been like a low trap raise or something like that. But I've really started buying back my rest periods from a number of my athletes and having them do some kind of repositioning between sets or some additional foam rolling or
Yep.
some manual tibial IR if they need that. And it's just been huge. So I'm assuming, is that a big part of what you guys are implementing when you're actually coaching your athletes?
Of course, like you got to understand the trade-offs that are going to happen. So if I put a SSB bar on my back, I got to create a posterior compression. Typically that's going to push you forward in space, and now you're kind of going into those compensations a little quicker. It's very easy to put them into you could do a reverse bear crawl. That's going to open up posterior space, and you're creating an active rest that's helping manage those compressions and kind of build back that space to where you're not causing more interference in themselves.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk sequential with some of these programs. Let's say we've got a super compressed athlete that comes in and we're thinking about, hey, this guy's so far in the tunnel, maybe we've got to start with some late propulsion to get some untwisting, and then we're adding early and middle. Just walk me through, like, for a particular phase, like what's your thought process when you're trying to reverse engineer or untwist some of these very elite throwers who just get bound up?
So the first thing is understanding the process of it. So you got to understand narrow's compensation sequence, and then you got to understand wide's compensation sequence, and you're trying to reverse engineer that. The other thing is the understand the phases of propulsion. So if a guy's stuck in late, I can't just throw him in middle. I got to go back. I got to put him early. Now he's found early. Okay, now I can move towards middle, and then now I can go towards late. And now I have that kind of sequence to work through. And then understanding where narrows need to be in space and wides need to be in space. So narrows are going to favor more of like an early middle-ish position. So that's where I'm trying to bring them back to. So I'm going to give them probably more exercises that are going to put them in an early position, versus wides I'm going to kind of favor a little more like true middle.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the mistakes you've made maybe in the past like 12 to 18 months of as you're learning these preferential zones of training? Just do you have any things that stand out where you're like, oh, like that was like obviously I should have been doing that, but just
Yeah.
learning this model, I feel like for a lot of people is very complex. I know there's been a number of times where I just wanted to throw my hands up and be like, just I hear you
Doubt.
talking, but I don't get it. I just tell everybody, I'm like, I'm too much of a smooth brain to adopt this, but I think it's really valuable and insightful to hear how you maybe work through some of this stuff
Yep.
because again, like baseball is just such a high velocity sport, and the faster things go, I think the harder it is to really understand and appreciate some of the nuances that come with this. So
Absolutely.
just if you can riff on a few like glaring mistakes and what you learned from them, I think that'd be super helpful to break down.
Biggest thing is skipping steps. You really want to rush yourself, and maybe you see a guy come in and you're like, oh wow, we really opened up that space that we were trying to get. Let me just hammer this now. And now I'm skipping steps 2 and 3, and I'm trying to get to 4 because I accomplished one. And so I would say that's a big one. And then just keeping it simple. I had a history teacher in middle school that always told me with everything, the KISS method of keep it simple, stupid. And I think that applies in almost all aspects of life, and especially in programming. Of you don't have to be super complex to get the results you want, and basically, as long as you have your goals in mind, you have your KPIs, and you know what you're trying to accomplish, there's going to be a simple method, and that will get you to where you want to be.
That's awesome, because one of the things I can, again, Greg did some of my programming. I'm not a baseball guy, but it was think complex, but program simply. It was very actionable stuff. Sure, there are a couple positional setups that I think were complicated, but
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say they were complex. Once I figured it out, it was pretty straightforward. And I would imagine, especially with the population that you guys serve, which is primarily like high school and college baseball players, where attention is
Slow.
the capacity for it is yeah, you actually need some of that stuff. You ask somebody to do some kind of diagonal set, and you look over and you're like, whoa, like their interpretation of this was really wild. So I'm sure that makes the whole process for you guys easier to actually implement some of these changes.
Yep, and the big thing is if it's not broke, don't, or if it's not broke, you don't have to change it, right? So if the diagonal sit worked for you in the first program, there's no reason to go into the second program and be like, okay, well, I got the shape change I wanted with that diagonal sit. Let me just bag it and get rid of it, and now I got to teach him a whole new exercise that he has to learn, even though it took him 4 weeks to really get down that diagonal sit. So you're kind of just causing yourself more stress the more you try to complicate the program.
Mm-hmm.
And like one thing I do is with my programs is if we got the shape change we wanted over that month, then I'm probably only going to change 3 or 4 things in the program, and it's mainly
Yeah.
the main lift or something in the pre-work, a med ball exercise, their cool down, something very simple that won't make a major effect, and it's not something that's very complex for them to learn. Because like you said, with high school and college guys, I mean, I can set a guy up exactly where I want him, turn around, talk to a kid, turn back around, and he's in a completely different position. And I'm like, you're still on the same set. Like, how did you mess that up? So definitely keeping it simple for the athletes as well is definitely helpful.
That's something we've gravitated to in our facility as well, where we used to change a lot of exercises program to program.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, first of all, just from a logistics standpoint, it's a nightmare teaching a whole new set of exercises every 4 weeks, right?
Yep.
And for me, they might be pretty simple variations, right? We're doing some kind of cable row, and maybe I modify the stance, but they completely forget what it is.
Yep.
But just having them take time to really cultivate excellence
Yeah.
with the exercises has been very, very valuable and has slowed the process down. And there's plenty of ways that we found we can manipulate stress through rest periods or loading or just the number of reps, even if it's something they're trying to acquire better motion on, that slow the process down, simplify it, and just allow us to get the outputs we want and at the level of execution, or like I said, excellence that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want to talk about a few tactical things, just training modalities.
Yep.
And one that I see you guys use is water bags. Now, I followed like the 108 guys, and they got a whole water bag training program. A lot of my baseball guys will come in, grab the bag, they'll do some random rotational exercise that they found with it. And my thought is they probably like the feel of this for some reason. But
Yep.
you and I, we think about these archetypes, we think about some of the compensatory sequences and how this modality is actually being utilized. So I'd love for you to break down your thought process on how the water's working, how you're using it, what kind of changes you're trying to drive with it, and then maybe just some of the ways that you're implementing it into the actual program.
So I would say we definitely look at water bags a lot different than normal pitching coaches and baseball coaches, where I feel as if, I mean, you'll see like Paul Skeens will put the water bag on his shoulders and get some mound feels where he's rotating with the bag.
Mm-hmm.
um, the way we use
He's
it
got he's
is
got that CJ Stroud warm up.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he rips it, and I love it. There's obviously nothing wrong with it. There's a
Hmm.
purpose with it. But the way we use it is more of a visual of your internal momentum and how you're moving the volume within your body, um, and propagating the waves up the body, right? So the water bag is, we like to use it more for a linear move or to visualize for a picture of, hey, as you go into your leg lift, like we have to get volume out of the pelvis so we can facilitate movement, right? And facilitate a rotation. So now whenever I do my water bag swing, I can see that water kind of move up the bag. And now I'm trying to keep it at the top of the bag as I drop into my load and keep the volume really up. Or guts, we use guts a lot whenever we talk about internal movement. But
Hmm.
so you're learning your linear moves with it. Whenever you're hitting, you're learning that linear load. And then we use a water ball as our rotational movement. So you create your left to right push that kind of sends you a left to right, wave, vortex wave, and you're trying to catch that in your right posterior if you're a right-handed pitcher, and being able to kind of visualize, okay, the wave is on the front of my foot. Okay, now it's moving towards the back of my right heel, right? So now I can see how that wave is kind of propagating through my body and how my guts are moving through, as I go through my movements. Um, and then we use those in the throwing program as I use it as a visual before they get into their throws. So if a kid's about to throw plyos, and my big thing for him that day is, okay, I want you to feel like your hands are floating, because the hands will replicate the guts, right? So if I create a good first move, my hands will kind of float up as I'm about to go into my move down the mound, and the bag will kind of help them visualize that and see that, like I said, see that water come up to the bag, and they're like, okay, I've captured that movement. Now I can go into my plows, and now I'm really trying to feel the hands kind of float up. And once we acquire that shape and that movement pattern, they can get it on the mound fairly easy.
Cool. So the bag is almost like a magnifying glass to what's happening with some of the internal dynamics, like the guts. Do
Yep.
you find when you're having your athletes use the bag prior to doing their plyos or throwing, are they able to let go of some of the compression that might normally be involved in that pattern? Like, does that in and of itself teach them how to relax and actually open up the way that you're looking for?
Absolutely, because they won't be able to get the movement in the bag that they're looking for. I had one kid that we were using the water ball, and so we're at step one, just trying to learn how to get them, going and get the vortex going, basically of that first left to right push, right?
Hmm.
And he has the water ball, and the water's just swishing back and forth. Can't get it to go in the vortex. And I, kept telling him, like, hey, you're trying to squeeze into this position instead of letting the waves kind of move up you and letting the force into the ground and your feet create the movement. Like, you're trying to squeeze yourself into a position instead of creating the movement through the ground. And so they kind of are forced to learn how to relax and how to let the waves move into this space, right? Or you'll be able to tell them, hey, you can't acquire this position because you have a compression on the right posterior. So now we can set them up into a ground-based reset, maybe do a cable chop, and it's like, okay, we've acquired this position. Let's hop back on the mound with the bag and try to acquire it again.
So you're just trying to get this sense of like literally it's fluid in the bag,
Fluidity,
like
yeah,
fluidity to the movement, right?
exactly.
Uh, I can't remember who was the first person that put it out, but they were talking. I remember specifically them talking about the golf swing and Tiger Woods, and it was like there's Tiger Wood is he's not tense throughout this movement. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
an initial impulse as he goes into the backswing, and then there's a relaxation. And then at the end of the backswing, there's another impulse, and that club starts coming the other way. And then at impact, there's another impulse. So it was almost these like kind of staccato periods of muscle contraction
Mm-hmm.
versus what I think a lot of athletes who try to force their way, which is I totally identify with because I'm a meathead. So I love to solve all problems with more force.
Yep.
But learning to actually shut this stuff off.
Yeah, and there's it's the same thing in the swing and in the throw. If you go
Mm-hmm.
watch a pitcher, whether they're thinking about it or not, and one that kind of pops in my mind and is a great example is like Jacob deGrom. Jacob deGrom is not on the mound thinking about, okay, let me create a left to right impulse, and then that's going to send the wave up my body, and my hands are going to float up, and I should feel like I have no weight in my body at the peak of my leg lift, and then now I create another impulse, and that's going to shoot me back to the left. They're not thinking about it, but if you watch them, um, you'll see how relaxed he is at the peak of his leg lift, and we call it the unweight stage, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
my guts are up, right? So I basically have no weight on that right foot, even though it's on the ground. And now, as they're about to come crashing down, I create another impulse to kind of send them back up, and that's as I move down the mound, and that's another unweight. So it's a very relaxed motion, and like you said, it's all fluidity, and I feel like it's a concept that a lot of coaches have adapted of being fluid, and they call it whippy, right? You'll hear pitchers all the time like, oh, my arm doesn't feel as whippy as it should, or you got to be more elastic with the arm. Um,
Mm-hmm.
all it is that fluidity and letting the wave propagate properly, right? So if the wrinkles in your shirt, I know this is gonna sound crazy, but whenever we watch pitchers, one thing we watch from the back view is the wrinkles in their shirt, because that's the wave moving through the body, right? So I can see as he's about to throw and he's going into layback, you'll see a wave work across the shirt and he'll smack him in the back of the scap, and you'll see it
Mm-hmm.
just disappear, and that's right as the arm whips through. So
Yep.
if that wave doesn't propagate correctly, you'll see it kind of kick out or kick back, and it kicks him in the lat. And now it's like a pushy arm motion, or the arm will kick through late. So being able to learn how to propagate the wave properly is it's big.
Yeah. And even for a guy like me, like I didn't play high level baseball, but I think about the unweighting phase on the force plates, right? The guys who can do that obviously are able to get more of this elastic restitution. It's like they're pulling that slingshot back. The guys who can't unweight or just have a roughness to the data, like they're just struggling to get into position, have a really difficult time maximizing their outputs.
Yep. Yeah. And that's it's a big thing that we look at on the force plates of when you look at the graph, their unweight phase is, you'll see just like a huge drop, right? If they
Mm-hmm.
can't acquire that unweight and get the guts up, then now I have to like squeeze myself into my descent. And now I'm basically compressing myself to where that wave can't come back up. My guts are buried in my pelvis, so now I don't have as much movement. It's going to be really hard to jump whenever everything's just buried down on yourself.
Yeah, it goes to shit real fast.
Yeah, really quick, really quick.
Okay. So obviously we're talking about this wave propagating. We're talking about what's ideal.
Mhm.
Obviously when somebody throws, they're going to have a reduction in their available movement as time, innings, number of pitches goes on, just due
Absolutely.
to the level of compression that they need. And so I feel when we talk about how do we restore these athletes after throwing, I feel like this arm care epidemic. I feel like what most programs are doing are just throwing every internal, external YTI into the bucket
Yep.
to hope something hits. So, how are obviously you guys have a different perspective, but how are you communicating the objectives of an arm care program or post throwing routine to your athletes?
So biggest thing is explaining to the athletes your muscles aren't tight. That's it's the biggest thing. So trying to explain to them the twist of the arm. So as I throw, we crank back into crazy amounts of external rotation, right? And now
Mm-hmm.
that creates a twist through the arm. And that's what gives that feeling of muscles being tight. But in reality, they're just very concentric because they're trying to pull you back to the position that you need to be in, right? So explaining that to them, and then kind of going through the process with them of, well, if we try to untwist the arm without down regulating the muscle activity, it's just going to crank back right to that space, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
got to down regulate the muscle activity, make my muscles kind of chill out to where whenever I do move the joints and the bones around and try to get that untwist happening, it can actually stick, right? So that's the biggest thing that we kind of go over with them. And I think a kid goes through an arm care program with us, and they think it's absolutely insane because they're not ripping, sleeper stretch and the I's, Y's, and T's like you said, and it's a 5 pound dumbbell curl with a supinated grip, and you're holding
Mm-hmm.
IR with the humerus. And they do that and they're like, oh wow, my elbow feels a lot better already. And I'm like, yeah, you
Mm-hmm.
still have 3 or 4 more exercises. Like, imagine how that's going to feel after you finish those exercises plus your second set, and now that we untwist the arm, now we can really propagate that wave through with, whether it's a plyo ball drop or we call it like a plyo slam with a head turn. And now we're moving into space that we just opened. And I'm really untwisting the arm, and now they feel better than they did before they threw,
Mm-hmm.
and they're able to come in the next day and still throw at a high level, and keep executing their throwing program, and just keeping that arm pain at a very minimal.
Yeah, we've done some of the humeral IR, forearm ER, modified take press. And I always apologize to my guys. I'm like, I'm really sorry I don't have a 2.5 pound weight. Five is all we got. And you can just watch them like just sweat with it. They're like, oh my God, like this is so hard. And they're like shaking. But I love it. But it works. It's so effective. But anyway, I think it's valuable because Bill's talked about it numerous times. Like there are these twists that happen. I think he's probably right. It's hard sometimes visually to see, but can't always trust our eyes. But you can see this represented in some of the ranges of motion that they have, some of the magnified ranges as well, some of the ones that are at a complete loss.
Yep.
And you don't really gain much headways until you can down regulate that muscle activity. And I don't think kids sometimes get a sense of how much tone is just hanging on after the fact. They feel cool, they're chilled out, but it's still like everything's just yanking down on that throwing arm.
Absolutely. And I feel like they also they also don't understand because they haven't been given that info or that knowledge yet. I remember my
Mm-hmm.
post throwing program in college was, I throw a 30 pitch bullpen and my arm is now hanging, and I go and I just crank some sleeper stretches, crank some I's, Y's, and T's while I'm making concentric muscles more concentric. So I'm just
Mm-hmm.
squeezing myself on a space that I'm already squeezed on. Like I can't recover like that, and I just think that knowledge and info needs to kind of be out there more. I wish I had a post throwing program like how we do here, and then there's so many different variations that you could do. If you can't execute the 5 pound dumbbell, you can grab a thin band and do that
Mm-hmm.
same curl. If you can't do a tape press, you can do a cable push down.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just so many variations and options you have that, I mean, I wouldn't say it's foolproof, but it's as close as you can get in a post throwing program of being foolproof.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty awesome what you guys are doing up there. So, man, I appreciate you coming on and like just sharing some of your knowledge, sharing your experience with what you're doing because I follow a lot of your guys' social posts. So if you're listening to this, following the Strength House, following JP, there's a ton of good information. And it's definitely a different perspective, but we've had a lot of success using some variation of this model that you guys are applying. But kudos to you guys. You just feel like you've done it at a really high level, and that's hard to find. I think the prevailing stance for most people is, okay, in theory, I get this, but how do I actually implement this into a comprehensive training program?
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that, man. And the big thing is being able to mix it, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's like cooking. You need a little bit of everything, right? So not I feel like especially with player performance, you do need some of those high output exercises. But like you
Mm-hmm.
said, there's compressions that are going to happen. There's compensations that are going to occur. I need to be able to manage those, and that's where I feel like the model and the ground based exercises really help out.
Absolutely, man. All
Yeah.
right. So, what's next for JP?
Right now, man, I'm currently working on obtaining my CSCS certification. That way, I can officially claim the strength coach title. And then
Bro,
within
that's
the
gonna feel that's
huh,
such like easy knowledge compared to what you're talking about.
yeah, The models definitely helped out with a little bit of the studying. The hard part is the parts that kind of contradict each other.
Mm-hmm.
But that's definitely next for me. And then probably obtaining a master's and then, working at the strength house for the time being. There's no better place. We call it the barn. Northeast Baseball is a club baseball program up here. I think top program in New England.
Mm-hmm.
But the barn is one of the best places on earth, and there's no place I'd rather be.
That's awesome, man. Well, you're off to a really high velocity start to your career. So
Yeah.
kudos. Thanks for coming on today. And tell my listeners where we can find out more about you online.
Best place is definitely Instagram. My Instagram is
Mm-hmm.
JP_Guerrero_TSH. I got some videos on there, some posts that guys can look at, and got a pre and post throw arm care. That those definitely help out, and anybody can. I'm always open for questions and people reaching out for help.
Absolutely, man. I'll make sure I tag that. And again, thanks for coming on, man. This was a huge honor, and I appreciate you carving the time.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, man. It's been a pleasure.
All right, take care.
Yeah, you too.
If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate and review us with 5 stars only, then subscribe so you can get all the latest updates.